This Embraer Phenom 300 has just landed 3/4 of the way into the runway from the threshold. The brakes and ground spoilers are working correctly, but the stopping distance is now extremely limited, and unfortunately this combination of events leads to some tragic results. To see what happens and how it got to this position, stay tuned. So this is the story of Hotel Zulu Indigo Bravo November, an Embraer Phenom 300 which was taking off from Milan Malpensa Airport on the 31st of July 2015 and flying to Blackbushe Airport in Surrey, which is in the UK. The flight was expected to be about an hour and 20 minutes. There were 4 people on board, 1 crew, which was the pilot who was operating in a single pilot position, and 3 passengers in the back who were all members of the Bin Laden family. Now, the pilot flying was a 57-year-old male. He had 11,000 hours total flying experience and 1,181 hours on type. He was reported to be physically and mentally well, and there was nothing on the cockpit voice recorder that suggested otherwise during the flight. The startup, taxi and takeoff were all uneventful. The aircraft took off from Milan Malpensa Airport at 12:34 and continued to the UK all uneventfully, passing over Paris and then eventually being handed over to London Area Control. London Area Control then provided descent clearances and routing information to Blackbushe Airport. At 14:01, the pilot then reported that he could see Blackbushe Airport, and he was handed over to Farnborough radar frequency, which he put in VHF 1, and VHF 2 was tuned to the Blackbushe information frequency. Still, quite uneventfully, the pilot flew over the Farnborough air traffic zone, and the pilot was cleared to descend at his discretion and instructed to contact Blackbushe information. As the Phenom 300 approached Blackbushe Airport, he informed them that he was going to do a visual circuit to land, and he'll be joining through an overhead join from runway 25. He noticed that there was a microlight on the runway that was just taken off, and requested what altitude the microlight will be operating at. He was informed the microlight would be operating at 1,100 feet on the QNH, and then he responded by saying he will maintain 2,000 feet on the QNH. If you're wondering what a QNH is, it's a pressure setting, usually given in hectopascals or in inches of mercury if you're in America, and the QNH is the air pressure at sea level, and a QFE, which is another one that pilots use, is the air pressure at the current aerodrome level. So an example of that using Blackbushe Airport, the QFE would read 0 on the altimeter when the aircraft's on the ground, whereas the QNH would read about 300 feet, as the aerodrome is 300 feet higher than sea level. So the microlight in this example, which is flying 1,100 feet at QNH, is actually flying about 800 feet from the ground. So as the pilot of the Phenom 300 approaches Blackbushe Airport, he gets the first of many traffic advisories. The Phenom 300 has a traffic collision avoidance system, and this basically scans out in front of the aircraft. If it determines that another aircraft is flying towards it, it will issue a traffic advisory, and if the confliction isn't stopped and the aircraft get closer together, it will then issue a resolution advisory, an RA, which will tell the pilots what to do. So the Phenom then joined the circuit through the overhead join, and the microlight now was on the downwind leg. The microlight was flying at 66 knots, and the Phenom at this point was flying 173 knots. So it was inevitable that the Phenom was going to have to overtake the microlight during the circuit. Both pilots from the Phenom and the microlight told air traffic that they were visual with each other, and a decision was made that the Phenom would land first and that the microlight would extend downwind to give him the space to do so. Now, as the Phenom reached the end of the downwind leg, he lowered the gear and started to descend, and from this point received several TAs and RAs relating to the microlight and another aircraft that was flying past. It was also heard on the cockpit voice recorder that he was still receiving transmissions from the Farnborough air traffic frequency. During the finals turn, the Phenom and the microlight started to get closer together. The TCAS RA then told the pilot to descend. He instead advanced the thrust levers and decided to climb away from the other aircraft.
Vertical speed. Adjust.
And once he was clear of the aircraft, he then brought the thrust levers back to idle and started to descend again. At this point, the aircraft was 1.4 nautical miles away from the runway threshold at 1,740 feet, and the airspeed was 137 knots. The Phenom then continued its approach with a rate of descent of about 3,000 feet per minute, and the aircraft stabilised its speed at 153 knots. During the approach, the aircraft then received 6 terrain warnings in the descent, before then crossing the runway threshold at 50 feet above aerodrome level, with an airspeed of 151 knots. This was 43 knots faster than the expected threshold speed. This additional speed caused the aircraft to float down the runway without touching down, and it finally landed 710 metres into the runway, only leaving 349 metres remaining. The brakes were applied and the ground spoiler was opened, but the aircraft continued down the runway before departing the paved surface, still travelling at 83 knots. It then struck an earth bank at the end of the runway, which caused the aircraft to become airborne temporarily, before then crashing into a car park that was just beyond the runway. The aircraft then burst into flames 1 second after coming to a stop, and unfortunately everybody on board was killed. So why did this happen? There were several factors at play here which led ultimately to a very high workload for the pilot at a critical stage of the flight. The most obvious one obviously being the microlight in the circuit at the same time as the Phenom, flying both at a different speed and a different height. There was also another light aircraft that was flying past the aerodrome as both aircraft were in the finals turn or at the end of their downwind leg. This added to both the confusion and complexity of the situation because it added TCAS warnings beyond those expected from the pilot for the microlight that he was aware of, which again added to the diminishing situational awareness that the pilot believed he had. One of the other factors was that Blackbushe Airport was operating an air traffic information service, which means the people in the tower are not permitted to issue instructions to the aircraft in the air, but they may only suggest courses of action. This led everyone involved to use the suggestions of other pilots in the circuit, and if there had been a suitably qualified controller in place, they could have issued appropriate instructions and resolved the potential conflict without relying on the suggestions of others. And the other factor was that the pilots had left the Farnborough frequency in one of his radio boxes, meaning that in addition to all the oral warnings he was getting from the TCAS system and from air traffic at Blackbushe, he was also listening in to the conversations that were happening at Farnborough as well. This was shown that from the end of the downwind leg to the threshold, the pilot of the Phenom had listened to 8 transmissions from the Farnborough frequency and also 6 transmissions from the Blackbushe frequency. And that was in a time span of 1 minute and 13 seconds. Also within that same 1 minute and 13 seconds, there were 6 TCAS announcements and 7 TORs, the terrain warnings, leading to a total of 30 oral events, all whilst trying to control the aircraft, look out for the other traffic, and getting the aircraft into a configuration and position to land appropriately. Also, one other factor that isn't mentioned in the final report, and is a bit of speculation, is potential outside pressures for either the pilot wanting to land as soon as possible, or the passengers in the back, who are ultimately the customers, who needed to be somewhere in a certain time frame, or pressured the pilot to land as soon as possible. I'm not saying that is the case, but there's potential that could have been going on in the background as well, adding to all the other confusion and frustration in this very short time frame. Because ultimately, this situation could have easily been avoided by simply going around and trying again. So you have to look at this from a different point of view of why didn't the pilot go around, and it looks as though it may have been his mental picture of the situation was warped, and he thought he did have enough time and space to get the aircraft in. But with the level of experience that he did have, there's potential outside pressures that also added to that mental pressure. It was also noted in the final report that the ground spoilers had retracted after the aircraft had landed. So the way it usually works is as the aircraft lands, the ground spoilers open, which adds extra drag to the aircraft, pushing it into the ground so the brakes are more effective. But once the aircraft drops below 45 knots, the ground spoilers will retract, or if the thrust levers are brought out of idle. So it's believed that the pilot did realise he wasn't going to brake in time and tried to go around, but obviously it was ultimately too late. One other finding from the investigation was that the fire service, which had dispatched 3 vehicles to go and assist with the crash, were confronted with a locked gate on their way round, as the area in which the aircraft had crashed was a commercial site just outside the airport. The first two vehicles approached the gate 1 minute and 34 seconds after the aircraft left the runway, and had to wait for the third vehicle that had the keys to the locked gate. It arrived 1 minute later, and all three vehicles were able to get to the crash site within 2 minutes and 46 seconds of the aircraft leaving the runway. It was determined that this delay did not add to the consequences of the crash, but it was determined that the 4 occupants of the aircraft survived the initial crash, but then subsequently died of the effects of the fire. So what changes came from this incident? So the operator of the Phenom 300 changed the rules that all Phenom 300 flights are to operate with both a commander and a co-pilot. They also changed their criteria for a stabilized approach when in VMC from 200 feet to 500 feet, meaning that if they're not stabilized by that height, they have to go around regardless. They also introduced enhanced recurrent training requirements for operating on short runways and training to make time-critical decisions with respect to landing performance and runway distances. And they brought out a standardized approach brief, now focusing on go-arounds when in VMC. For Farnborough air traffic, there was to be a review on whether controllers were providing an appropriate service to their substations when under a high workload, and it was recommended that they give out different squawks to each individual aircraft to make them more easily identifiable. And the final part for Blackbushe Airport itself was that each individual fire engine needed to carry the crash gate keys, which has now been implemented. But again, like I said before, this video isn't designed to point blame at anybody, especially the pilots involved. It's more to see how humans react to certain situations and learn and grow from them. So for example, with this one, the pilot was so overwhelmed by information that his mental model either changed or his willingness just to land, no matter the cost, overtook his mental capacity to make a decision to go around and potentially go through that process again. So I always find it fascinating to look through these reports and to see what's happened in these events, so ultimately we can all learn from them. Thanks for watching, guys, and can I just say thank you for the support that I've received so far, and thank you for your lovely comments that I've received, especially on the last video. I really do appreciate it. Thanks again, and I'll see you guys in the next one.